So we're basically looking at an X-ray of the global system right now.
Yeah.
And the problem isn't that we can't find the fracture, it's that the entire skeleton just looks utterly shattered.
Right. It's a total myth.
Because usually when we talk about a diagnosis, whether it's, I don't know, medicine or engineering, there's this expectation of precision.
Yeah.
Like you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and you have a clear binary answer.
Exactly. Broken or not broken.
Right. It's clean, it's visible, and frankly, it's kind of comforting because you know exactly what needs to be fixed. But you step into the world of global economics or geopolitics or tech today, and that diagnostic machine is just spitting out static.
Oh, completely. Every
Right.
single time you open a newsfeed, it feels like a totally different vital organ of the global system is just going into simultaneous failure.
Yeah. Which creates this overwhelming sense of vertigo for anyone paying attention. I mean, if you're listening to this, you probably feel it.
Oh, for sure. You've got runaway inflation in one sector, hyperdeflation in another, and then this massive political polarization that seems to just defy basic electoral logic.
Right. And then technological breakthroughs moving so fast, they feel like they belong in like a sci-fi novel.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And, well, our mission for this deep dive is to clear that water.
Exactly.
We are taking this massive body of analytical work from a really prominent tech insider and systems theorist, and we're going to build what you could call a force diagram of the modern world.
I really love the force diagram framework because it borrows from basic physics.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to know the trajectory of a rocket, you can't just look at the thrusters pushing it upward.
Right, you'd be missing half the equation.
Exactly. You have to measure the gravity pulling it down, the atmospheric drag, the
Yeah.
wind shear. You have to map out every single force acting simultaneously on that object to predict where it's actually going to land.
And today, we are mapping out exactly why your grocery bill is soaring, why AI is fundamentally threatening white-collar labor, and why the political system isn't just dysfunctional, but is structurally designed to tear itself apart under these specific pressures.
But before we dive in, we have to put on our lab coats and establish some ground rules here.
Yeah, this is crucial.
We are stepping into highly charged territory. We're going to be examining the behavior, the survival mechanisms, and the internal logic of both the Democratic and Republican factions in the U.S., alongside global superpowers like China.
And the only way this works is if we maintain absolute analytical detachment.
Right. And just to be super clear to everyone listening, we are not here to endorse political theories, and we are certainly not taking sides.
Not at all. We're treating these political factions purely as theoretical frameworks, what we'll later explore as meta-organisms to see how they react when placed under unprecedented pressure.
Right, because if you let your own political team loyalties cloud your vision, you're going to completely misread the diagram. So consider this an exercise in cold structural mechanics.
Sounds good.
Let's start with the upward forces on our diagram, right? The technological engines. Because for decades, the dominant conversation around the future has been anchored by people like Ray Kurzweil and the concept of the singularity.
Right, with a capital S.
Yeah, this singular monolithic moment in the future where artificial intelligence finally eclipses human intelligence, changing everything forever. But looking at the data in the text we have in front of us, that monolithic view is kind of outdated.
It is. We aren't waiting for a singularity anymore. We are currently living through a plurality of singularities, all happening simultaneously.
It's like the everything everywhere all at once phenomenon, but translated into hard data.
Exactly. We are seeing multiple distinct technological curves that have suddenly just gone vertical. They're reaching critical mass at the exact same moment, which creates this compound volatility.
Yeah, let's look at the solar singularity as our first example. Specifically, what's happening across the African continent.
Oh, this is fascinating. If you track solar adoption over there, it's no longer a gradual slope, it's just a straight vertical line.
Straight up.
Yeah. And it is vital to understand the mechanism behind this. This adoption isn't being driven by massive government subsidies or climate mandates or Western NGOs trying to build, centralized green grids.
Right. It's happening because the tech fundamentally outgrew the need for a grid entirely.
Yes.
For decades, the hurdle for electrification in developing nations was the infrastructure. You needed billions of dollars, immense state capacity, and you had to deal with corruption and, frankly, literal copper theft from the wires.
But solar panels went from being these fragile, hyper-expensive pieces of delicate tech to just ruggedized commodities manufactured at massive scale.
Yeah, you can literally throw these modern panels in the back of a pickup truck, drive them out to a remote village, drop them on a roof, and they just work.
You completely bypass the permitting office, the centralized power plant, and those fragile transmission lines entirely.
And the secondary consequences of that decentralized power are immediate. Like, the moment a village has reliable off-grid power, they plug in cheap smartphones.
Right.
And suddenly, they have access to digital banking, global information networks, decentralized communication. The tech reached its logical conclusion of zero marginal cost and infinite scalability.
But that's just the physical infrastructure. We also have to look at the internet dating singularity, which is fundamentally rewiring human sociology.
Oh man, the numbers on this are staggering.
They really are. If you look at how humans have met their reproductive partners for the last few centuries, church, community gatherings, friends of friends, the workplace, local bars, those methods have plummeted to near zero.
It's crazy.
Over the last 10 to 15 years, algorithmic internet dating has overwhelmingly replaced almost every traditional mode of human matchmaking.
We have basically outsourced the biological and social reproduction of our entire species to matching algorithms.
Yeah, that alone is a societal earthquake. But it's happening so quietly in the background of our phones that we barely even register it as a singularity.
Right. And then you layer in the financial and physical realms. Like, we're seeing a gold singularity, where decentralized and non-fiat stores of value are spiking as trust in traditional state currencies degrades.
And we're seeing a robot singularity, where physical automation is moving out of highly controlled factory environments and into unstructured real-world logistics.
But the vector that anchors this entire theory of immediate systemic disruption is the agent singularity.
Yes. This is the big one.
Yep.
We are moving past AI that just, generates text or images and entering the era of AI agents capable of executing complex, multi-step cognitive tasks.
Let's really drill down into the mechanics of that because it's so easy to get lost in the hype. We are talking about software that can be given a high-level goal like research these 5 companies, compare their quarterly earnings, draft a summary report, and email it to my team, and it just goes and does it.
It's wild. But I do want to temper this with a crucial caveat from the source material.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
When we look at the charts tracking the time it takes an AI agent to complete a human-level task, the benchmarks can be a bit tortured. A lot of these metrics are based on a 50% accuracy rate.
Right.
And critics rightly point out that a legal brief or a medical diagnosis that is only 50% accurate is, well, effectively useless.
That is a very fair skepticism. The exact slope of the graph might be debated by engineers.
Sure.
However, the subjective on-the-ground reality of anyone using these tools today, whether it's Claude or advanced versions of ChatGPT or specialized coding copilots, it makes the debate over precise benchmarks somewhat irrelevant.
Because even if the AI hallucinates occasionally, the cost of generating that cognitive labor has collapsed to near zero.
Exactly. If you are a law firm and an AI can draft a 90-page contract in 3 seconds for 5 cents, you don't need a team of junior associates to do the initial drafting anymore.
Right. You just need one senior partner to review the AI's output for accuracy.
It completely hollows out the middle tier of the knowledge economy. The subjective experience is just startling. It doesn't matter if the AI is perfectly autonomous yet. The vector is moving up and to the right at a terrifying speed, and the cost per token of intelligence is trending towards zero.
So we have this massive cluster of plural singularities, right? Solar, dating, robotics, AI agents. These are immense, inherently deflationary forces pushing the global rocket upward.
Because technology's natural state is to make things cheaper, faster, and more abundant.
Exactly. But this creates a massive friction point because we have to look at the downward force on our diagram, the gravity.
And that gravity is the legacy economic engine, specifically the architecture of debt in Keynesian economic management.
Right. To understand why systems are breaking, we have to look at how this downward macroeconomic force collides with the upward technological force.
The analytical framework we're exploring uses a deliberately provocative phrase to describe modern Keynesianism. It calls it communism for wimps.
That phrase instantly grabs you, but it definitely requires unpacking, so you don't just sound like we're reciting a political talking point.
Yeah, please unpack that.
What we were really talking about is the mechanics of wealth extraction. Let's look at the historical parallel being drawn in the text. When the Soviet Union, under Lenin or Stalin, decided they needed to extract, say, 10 or 20% of the agricultural wealth from the population to fund their industrialization, how did they execute that?
Well, they relied on visible physical violence.
Yes, they compiled lists of productive farms, they sent armed bureaucrats to kick down doors, physically confiscate the grain, seize the property, and violently suppress or eliminate the farmers, the kulaks.
It was brutal. The terror was the point.
But the systemic catastrophe of that method wasn't just the moral horror, it was the absolute destruction of operational knowledge.
Right, because a farm isn't just dirt and seeds. It is a highly complex biological and logistical machine. The farmer holds all the institutional knowledge of when the soil needs aeration, how the microclimate affects the irrigation schedule, how to rotate the crops.
Exactly. And when the state physically liquidated the farmer to steal the wealth, they destroyed the human software that ran the hardware.
And that catastrophic loss of knowledge is what directly caused the massive cascading famines across the Soviet Union. To steal the wealth, they had to visibly destroy the means of production.
Now, contrast that crude, visible mechanism with the evolution of modern central banking.
Okay.
The premise here is that Keynesian monetary policy, specifically the ability of a central bank to artificially expand the money supply through inflation and suppressed interest rates, accomplishes the exact same goal.
Wow.
It extracts a percentage of the population's wealth to fund the state apparatus, but it does so entirely invisibly without firing a single shot and, crucially, without physically destroying the operational machinery of the economy.
Which brings up, honestly, the most illuminating analogy in this entire framework. The evolution of predatory camouflage.
Oh, the saber-toothed tiger versus the mosquito?
Yes. Think about a saber-toothed tiger. It is an apex predator, it is terrifying, and it is deadly. But its existence is highly visible. If it's coming to kill you, you see it sprinting across the savannah, you hear it roaring, and you know exactly what the threat is.
Soviet communism, with its armed guards and gulags, was the saber-toothed tiger. It was visible extraction.
But inflation, the quiet printing of fiat currency, is a mosquito.
Right. A mosquito doesn't roar.
No, it lands softly on your arm, it injects a mild chemical anesthetic to numb the local nerve endings, and it quietly drinks your blood.
And by the time the anesthetic wears off and you actually feel the itch, the mosquito is long gone and your resources have already been extracted.
The central banking system operates as macroeconomic anesthesia. It's brilliant camouflage.
It really is. By surrounding the actual mechanism of wealth extraction with incredibly dense mathematical models, jargon about, providing market liquidity, and debates over 2% target inflation rates, the central bank completely obscures the reality of what is happening.
They can hit a digital button, dilute the purchasing power of every single dollar sitting in your bank account, and transfer that purchasing power to the state, and nobody kicks down your door.
You wake up with all your physical possessions intact, but your ability to survive has been fundamentally diminished.
And we see the psychological fallout of this invisible theft every single day. Because the extraction is camouflaged, the populace misdirects its anger. Let's look at the highly relatable Chipotle scenario from the text to illustrate this.
Yes, the shrinkflation dynamic. Imagine you are standing in line at Chipotle. You get to the counter and you notice that the burrito costs $1 more than it did last year. The scoop of guacamole is noticeably smaller, and maybe the restaurant is understaffed, so the tables are dirty.
Right. And what is the immediate visceral reaction of the average consumer? They pull out their smartphone, they take a picture of the skimpy burrito, and they post it online, raging against the greedy corporate executives who are nickel and diming them to pad their profit margins.
The anger is entirely misdirected at the immediate point of contact. The consumer sees the corporation as the thief, but what they are completely blind to is the invisible macroeconomic mosquito.
Because the reality is that both the consumer standing in line and the corporation operating the restaurant have been simultaneously robbed by the central bank's inflation.
Exactly. The cost of the avocados, the commercial lease, the supply chain logistics, all of it skyrocketed because the money supply was diluted. The corporation is shrinking the portion sizes just to keep the lights on, and the consumer is outraged because their paycheck buys less food.
The Fed has effectively siphoned off a massive percentage of the entire economy's underlying purchasing power, left the remaining shrunken pie on the table, and let the individual consumer and the business fight to the death over the scraps.
They are battling each other, completely unaware of the third party that walked away with the actual value.
It's wild. And to prove just how utterly abstract and effortless this central bank theft has become, We have to look at the mechanics of quantitative easing. There's a specific NPR report from 2010 cited in the source that details the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis, and it is just mind-bending.
Yeah, when the mortgage-backed securities market collapsed, the global financial system essentially froze. To inject liquidity and bail out the banks, the Federal Reserve didn't dig up gold, they didn't collect massive new taxes, and they didn't manufacture goods.
No. Two human beings sitting at a computer terminal in a secure room at the Federal Reserve simply typed numbers into a digital ledger.
With a few keystrokes, they created $1.25 trillion out of absolutely thin air and used it to buy toxic assets from the banking sector.
We hear the word trillion thrown around so casually now that it loses all meaning. But think about the physical reality of $1 trillion. Imagine a massive global corporation trying to generate $1 trillion in pure profit.
It's unfathomable. Think of the millions of hours of human labor required, the complex supply chains, the physical mining of resources, the engineering, the logistics.
The sheer thermodynamic energy required to generate that much real-world value is incomprehensible. And yet, two bureaucrats generated that exact equivalent purchasing power in a fraction of a microsecond by just hitting enter on a keyboard.
Which brings us to the most vital question of macroeconomics. When $1 trillion is spoken into existence out of thin air, who actually gets to spend it first?
Right, this is the invisible mechanism of structural inequality. It is governed by an economic principle known as the Cantillon effect, named after an 18th century economist, Richard Cantillon, who observed how newly minted gold entered the economy.
Let's bring the Cantillon effect down, because if you don't understand this, you really cannot understand why the political system is fracturing.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine a highly skilled counterfeiter operating out of a basement. They print a massive stack of perfectly undetectable fake $100 bills, say $10 million worth. When the counterfeiter walks out of their basement, the broader economy has no idea this new money exists.
Right, so the counterfeiter gets to spend that newly printed money at today's existing prices.
Exactly. They buy up prime real estate, they buy equities, they buy fine art, they extract maximum purchasing power because the prices of those assets haven't adjusted to the new money supply yet.
But what happens next?
Well, the person who sold the house to the counterfeiter now takes those millions of dollars and deposits them in a bank or uses them to buy luxury goods. As that newly printed money begins to circulate outward, moving step by step through the layers of the economy, the market starts to realize there is a massive new influx of cash chasing the exact same amount of physical goods.
And when more money chases the same amount of goods, the prices of those goods naturally rise to find equilibrium. By the time that counterfeit $100 bill finally trickles down to a cashier working at a grocery store in Kansas, the macroeconomic environment has entirely shifted.
The prices of housing, energy, and food have all skyrocketed to absorb the inflated money supply. The cashier technically has a new $100 bill, but its actual purchasing power has already been hollowed out.
Now replace the counterfeiter in the basement with the Federal Reserve, and replace the newly printed bills with quantitative easing.
The people physically and systemically closest to the money printer, the massive financial institutions, the defense contractors, the concentrated political centers like Washington, D.C., they receive that money first.
And they benefit immensely. They buy up the assets.
But the people furthest away from the printer, the working class, the traditional manufacturing sectors, the people living on fixed incomes, they receive the money last, long after inflation has already devastated its value.
It is a massive structural wealth transfer from the periphery of the country to the center, from what this analytical framework broadly categorizes as the red working class factions, directly into the pockets of the blue financial and administrative factions.
And the literal proof of this dynamic isn't just theoretical. It's visible in the divergence of prices across different sectors of the economy over the last 30 years. It is a tale of two completely different economic realities.
If you look at a chart tracking inflation versus deflation since the late 90s, the split is stunning. Anything that is heavily regulated, subsidized, or structurally intertwined with the U.S. government's credit expansion healthcare, higher education, housing, childcare, the cost of those things has rocketed into the stratosphere.
The inflation in those sectors vastly outpaces wage growth.
But look at the bottom half of that chart. Everything that the government mostly leaves alone, everything that is exposed to the hyper-efficiency of the internet or the scale of global manufacturing, televisions, computer software, toys, cellular service, the cost of those things has absolutely plummeted.
They have hyper-deflated. And it's not just consumer gadgets. This brings up the Haber process, which is a perfect example of technological deflation keeping the world alive.
Yeah, the Haber process, or Haber-Bosch, is the chemical procedure developed in the early 20th century to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. It is quite literally how we create the cheap fertilizer that sustains the global agricultural system.
Without it, the Earth could probably only support about half of its current population. Because the Haber process is an engineering and chemical technology driven by pure industrial efficiency and scaled heavily by global manufacturing hubs like China, the cost of producing that life-saving fertilizer has trended downward.
Imagine if the Haber process was regulated, subsidized, and cartelized the way the American healthcare system or the university system is. The cost of fertilizer would have increased 400% over the last 20 years. The cost of food would be astronomical, and we would be dealing with global starvation.
Because technology, in its natural state, wants to make things abundant and cheap. But the Keynesian economic engine fights that natural deflation every step of the way.
The traditional economic argument is that deflation is a localized disaster, right? The theory claims that if things consistently get cheaper, consumers will hoard their money, waiting for prices to drop further, and the economy will grind to a halt because nobody is buying anything.
But the framework we are examining completely demolishes that argument by simply pointing to the technology sector.
Yeah, Moore's law is the ultimate counter-argument to the fear of deflation. We all know that computers get vastly cheaper, faster, and more powerful every single year. A smartphone today has more computing power than the Apollo missions, at a fraction of the cost.
If the Keynesian fear of deflation were true, nobody would ever buy a laptop because they know a better, cheaper one is coming in 12 months.
But people spend billions of dollars on computers right now. Why? Because the immediate productivity value of having the technology today far outweighs the marginal savings of waiting a year.
Exactly. Healthy, technologically driven deflation doesn't stall the economy. It frees up capital for new innovations. But an economy addicted to debt cannot survive deflation.
Ah, right.
If prices drop, the massive debts accumulated by governments and corporations become mathematically impossible to pay back. Therefore, the central bank must constantly inflate the currency to inflate away the real value of the debt.
So, step back and look at our force diagram at this moment. We have a macroeconomic pie that is being secretly, systematically shrunk for the average citizen through invisible inflation. Their purchasing power is evaporating.
Simultaneously, the twin upward forces of the internet and hyper-efficient global manufacturing are radically shifting where value is created and who actually holds the leverage. The old rules of the 20th century economy are being shredded.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the powder keg. When the economic pie shrinks and the camouflage of the mosquito starts to wear off because the pain of inflation becomes too acute to ignore, how do the established political and cultural factions react?
Well, when they suddenly realize they are being squeezed to death by forces they can't control, they don't gracefully accept their decline, they go to war.
And this brings us out of the realm of pure economics and into the trenches of modern political warfare. The analytical source maps out what it terms the four-faction war: Blue America, Red America, Tech, and China.
And the core premise that dictates this entire conflict is a simple, brutal reality. The internet is upstream of everything. It is the technological river that feeds all these other societal systems. And right now, that river is violently washing away the traditional American political binary.
Wait, how exactly did this timeline play out? Why is everyone so angry right now compared to the 1990s?
To understand the mechanics of this war, we have to look at how this technological disruption specifically targets the economic bases of the two major political factions. We talked about the plural singularities earlier. The source theorizes a profound division of labor and how these singularities inflict pain.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First, there is digital AI software agents, large language models, algorithmic automation. This force is laser targeted at what we can broadly call blue jobs.
Let's clearly define what we mean by blue jobs in this context. We aren't just talking about people who vote for Democrats. We're talking about the structural foundation of the blue knowledge economy.
Right. This is the university-educated, symbol-manipulating class. Journalists, corporate lawyers, Hollywood screenwriters, diversity consultants, university administrators, the sprawling federal bureaucracy.
Their entire economic and cultural power is derived from their ability to process information, manipulate text, and navigate complex bureaucratic rules.
And digital AI is an apex predator built specifically to hunt in that exact ecosystem. As we discussed with the agent singularity, if a large language model can synthesize a 500-page regulatory document, draft a compliance report, and generate a corresponding marketing campaign in a matter of seconds, the leverage of that entire knowledge worker class collapses.
They lose their monopoly on information processing.
Exactly. But the disruption isn't one-sided. Conversely, the framework argues that physical AI, advanced robotics, autonomous logistics, and hyperscaled foreign manufacturing specifically targets and disrupts red jobs.
These are the jobs rooted in physical reality and localized labor. Traditional domestic manufacturing, trucking, heavy industry, and the enlisted ranks of the military.
So digital AI hollows out the blue cognitive base, and physical AI, heavily accelerated by China's manufacturing dominance, hollows out the red industrial base. But to truly understand the sheer anger and dysfunction of our current political climate, we have to trace exactly when and how this timeline fractured.
Because if you lived through the 1990s, the world felt entirely different. The 90s felt like a vacation from history.
It really did. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States entered this unipolar moment. We were the unchallenged global hyperpower.
The economic pie was expanding massively. The American geopolitical empire was basically uncontested. And crucially, neither the consumer internet nor the Chinese manufacturing apparatus were mature enough to pose any real systemic threats.
Because the pie was growing, the political factions could afford to be moderate. They weren't backed into a corner fighting for survival.
The catastrophic inflection point was the 2008 global financial crisis. That shock fundamentally altered the trajectory.
Yes. When the capital markets froze, every single corporation, local government, and media institution was suddenly forced into a brutal game of survival. They had to figure out how to immediately do more with vastly less.
And when they looked around desperately for efficiencies, the deflationary forces we just discussed, the internet and China, were finally mature enough to be deployed at scale.
Let's trace the collapse of the blue faction's stronghold first. Traditionally, one of the main pillars of blue cultural and political power was the legacy media newspapers, television networks, the institutions that controlled the narrative.
If you look at the data, traditional newspaper advertising revenue peaked right around the year 2000. It was the license to print money. But post-2008, as the economy contracted, businesses couldn't afford expensive, inefficient print ads anymore.
And at that exact moment, the algorithms of Google and Facebook had reached maturity. They offered highly targeted, hyper-efficient, dirt-cheap digital advertising.
The advertising revenue curves for the legacy media absolutely cratered, falling off a cliff, while the revenue curves for Google and Facebook went perfectly vertical.
The internet effectively cannibalized the financial foundation of the blue media apparatus. They lost their monopoly on distribution and revenue.
And the timeline for the Republican collapse happens almost symmetrically. Right around 2010, feeling that exact same post-2008 financial pressure, traditional American manufacturing companies realized they could no longer afford the costs of domestic labor and regulatory compliance.
To survive, they radically offshored their supply chains. This was the exact window where Chinese manufacturing dominance officially flipped American manufacturing. The industrial base that sustained the red political faction was hollowed out and shipped across the Pacific.
Both factions are suddenly bleeding out. The Democrats are losing the information war and their media revenue to the tech monopolies. The Republicans are losing the industrial war and their working-class employment base to China.
And in biology, what happens when a massive, powerful organism is backed into a corner starving and stripped of its traditional resources?
It doesn't analyze the macro trends. It violently lashes out at whatever is closest to it.
Right. This brings us to the retaliation phase of the force diagram. The established parties couldn't necessarily strike at the root causes of their pain. You can't outlaw the invention of the microchip, and you can't easily unwind 30 years of globalized trade.
So they struck at their immediate borders. Let's look at the blue retaliation first. How does a legacy media apparatus survive when the internet has stolen all its classified ad and display ad revenue?
It has to invent a new product that generates massive algorithmic engagement, and that product was high arousal moral outrage.
The framework traces this by looking at a very specific metric, right? The frequency of ideological buzzwords associated with wokeness or extreme social justice rhetoric in publications like the New York Times.
Yes. For decades, the usage of these terms was essentially flat, relegated to niche academic circles. Then, right around 2013, the exact moment the legacy media is facing bankruptcy due to the internet's disruption, the usage of these highly polarizing words spikes vertically.
It is a mechanical, algorithmic survival strategy disguised as a moral awakening. The Facebook and Twitter algorithms of the 2010s heavily rewarded anger, in-group, out-group conflict, and moral superiority.
By pivoting to this highly charged ideological warfare, the legacy media generated the viral clicks and the emotional engagement they desperately needed to keep the lights on. It allowed them to claim an absolute moral high ground, which served as a weapon to paint their political rivals as fundamentally illegitimate.
But the blue faction didn't just attack the Republicans. They actively retaliated against the internet itself. This is the era of the techlash that dominated the late 2010s.
The legacy institutions realized that tech CEOs had usurped their power, so they began hauling Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai in front of congressional hearings. They launched massive cancellation campaigns.
They pressured these tech companies to install sprawling internal DEI bureaucracies and trust and safety councils. It was a direct attempt by the administrative state to assert bureaucratic control over the technology that was replacing them.
Okay, so that's the blue counterattack. Now let's look at the red retaliation. The Republican base is feeling the immense visceral pain of their physical world being dismantled, factories shuttered, opioid crises hollowing out manufacturing towns, the loss of institutional dignity.
They retaliated on two distinct fronts. First, against the blue establishment by electing Donald Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
It was a massive, chaotic, populist rejection of the entire administrative system that had overseen their decline.
And second, they attempted to retaliate against China via the trade war. They tried to use the power of the federal government to slap sweeping tariffs on foreign goods, desperately trying to rebuild physical borders and economic walls to protect the physical jobs that were bleeding out of the country.
But the most devastating conclusion drawn by this analytical framework, the harsh reality of the force diagram, is that the retaliation failed. Both of the traditional political factions ultimately lost their macro wars.
They absolutely lost. The blue faction tried to reign in the tech sector, but look at the outcome. They lost control of the media narrative to uncensored, decentralized platforms like X. They lost a significant portion of their financial control to the rise of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. And they are currently losing the cognitive labor war to AI agents.
If you want proof of who won that battle, just look at the stock market. The source points to the fact that the magnificent 7 tech stocks, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, etc., have absolutely ripped upward, driving almost all the growth in the market, while the remaining 493 stocks in the S&P 500 have essentially traded flat.
Tech America defeated Blue America in the war for economic supremacy.
And on the other side, despite the aggressive rhetoric and the tariffs of the trade war, the Republican faction ultimately lost to China. Tariffs might offer temporary artificial protection within the domestic borders of the United States, but out in the neutral global market, the story is entirely different.
Let's talk about BYD and the electric vehicle market, because this is the perfect illustration of that defeat. BYD is a Chinese automaker. They didn't start by building cars, they started by building cheap batteries for cell phones.
Over the years, they meticulously built a fully vertically integrated supply chain. They own the lithium mines, they manufacture the battery cells, they build the microchips, and they assemble the cars.
Tesla, as brilliant as it is, still relies on a fractured global supply chain for many of its components.
So what happens when a U.S. company and a vertically integrated Chinese company compete in a completely neutral territory, say Hungary or parts of South America, where neither country has a home field advantage or protective tariffs?
The sheer hyper-deflationary scale of China's manufacturing wins. BYD can offer an EV with comparable technology to a Tesla at a fraction of the cost. The Chinese manufacturing base simply outcompeted the American industrial base on a global scale.
Furthermore, while the U.S. was focused on internal culture wars, China quietly built the world's largest navy and secured massive control over global shipping logistics.
The traditional binary is completely broken. Tech beat the blues, and China beat the reds.
Wait, let's pause here. Because if you are listening to this and you look around your local environment, you might be screaming at your device right now. You might be thinking, hold on. If the traditional political parties have been so thoroughly defeated by tech and foreign manufacturing on the macro level, why do they still seem so incredibly powerful locally?
Right. Why do state governors and local bureaucracies still wield so much control over our daily lives, our taxes, and our businesses?
Exactly.
And that extremely valid question leads us to what I consider the most brilliant and frankly the most unsettling concept in this entire deep dive. It is the theory of the meta-organism and the idea of the state as a startup.
I really want to spend a lot of time on this because once you grasp this concept, you will never look at local politics or the news cycle the same way again. It completely shatters the illusion of how we are taught democracy works.
The source asks us to stop viewing political parties as a collection of rational, individual human beings sitting in a room debating policy to find the best outcome for the citizenry. Instead, we have to view these political factions as biological meta-organisms.
It relies on the biological concept of emergent intelligence. Think of an ant colony or a massive school of fish or a flock of starlings murmuring in the sky. Any single individual ant is essentially blind.
Right. It doesn't possess the cognitive capacity to understand the grand strategic architecture of the colony. It is simply following a localized pheromone trail, reacting to immediate stimuli.
But when you put a million ants together, the colony as a whole possesses a terrifying emergent intelligence. The meta-organism acts optimally to secure resources, defend its borders against rival colonies, and ensure its own survival and expansion.
We are all part of meta-organisms. Think about your own body. You, as a conscious human, are a meta-organism made up of trillions of individual cells. Your skin cells have no idea what your brain is thinking. Your white blood cells aren't debating philosophy, they just attack invaders.
But they all operate under a unified biological imperative to keep the overarching organism alive.
This framework argues that the California Democratic Party, or the Texas Republican Party, functions exactly like an ant colony. The individual politicians, the campaign managers, local voters, they might just be reacting to a localized incentive, like winning a single election cycle, or reacting to a single news story.
They might genuinely believe they're acting on individual moral principles.
But the political meta-organism as a whole possesses an emergent logic that is ruthlessly biologically optimizing for its own power and resource accumulation.
Let me throw a massive real-world pushback at this theory, because this is where my mind immediately went. Let's look at California over the last few years. California has continuously proposed and implemented incredibly aggressive wealth taxes and regulatory burdens.
Yeah.
As a direct result, they have successfully driven away trillion-dollar tech billionaires. Elon Musk moved Tesla and X out of the state. Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, the architects of the modern internet, have all systematically relocated massive portions of their wealth and operations to places like Texas or Florida.
Right.
If a state is a rational organism trying to survive, driving away your golden geese, deliberately amputating your own massive tax base, seems strategically insane. Why would an organism intentionally starve itself?
It seems like suicidal insanity only if you view the state through the lens of a traditional business trying to maximize its gross domestic product. But this is where the framework introduces a dark, incredibly illuminating meta-logic. You have to understand what these political organisms actually are. For these political factions, the state itself is their startup.
The state is their startup. Let's meticulously unpack the implications of that phrase.
Think about the people who rise to the absolute apex of these political meta-organisms. Governors, powerful mayors, entrenched senators. Generally speaking, they are not visionary entrepreneurs. They do not possess the skills to build highly competitive, innovative businesses in a ruthless free market. They aren't technologists or engineers.
What they possess is a very specific, highly refined evolutionary talent for coalitional politics. They are apex predators of bureaucracy. They know how to build alliances, acquire leverage, and wield the coercive machinery of the state.
So if your singular talent is bureaucratic manipulation, and you are terrible at free market competition, your only path to acquiring supreme wealth, status, and power is to successfully capture the machinery of the state itself.
You don't build a company, you capture the government, and you use its monopoly on taxation and regulation as your revenue model.
Exactly. And once you have captured that state machinery, your perspective on who your enemies are radically shifts. If you run the California political startup, a tech billionaire with immense independent resources, control over global communication platforms, and massive technological leverage is not your golden goose.
They are an existential threat. They are your primary competitor for power within your territory. A billionaire can fund a rival political coalition. They can use their media platforms to bypass your carefully controlled narrative. Oh, wow. The light bulb just went on. When you view it through that lens, passing a massive punitive wealth tax isn't an economic mistake. It is a brilliant win-win biological strategy for the political meta-organism.
It functions exactly like an autoimmune response or a corporate hostile takeover. You target the billionaire. If they stay and pay the tax, you have successfully extracted their wealth to fund your own bureaucratic startup.
If the tax is so burdensome that they choose to pack up and leave the state, you win even bigger. You have successfully forced your most dangerous competitor to deport themselves.
Every single independent billionaire or powerful corporation that leaves California permanently cements the unchallenged one-party monopoly of the political faction that pushed them out. They are intentionally purifying their environment to secure their absolute control over the remaining resources.
And the source points to the stark political data to back this up. If you look at the electoral maps and legislative control, California has essentially functioned under pure, unassailable one-party rule since roughly 2011.
Traditional competitive two-party democracy within the borders of that state has effectively been eradicated. The meta-organism achieved total dominance of its host environment.
And it is vital to point out, maintaining our lab coat neutrality here, that the Republican meta-organisms are executing the exact same biological imperative in their own territories.
Oh, definitely. Look at Florida or Texas. They are utilizing the machinery of the state gerrymandering districts, implementing specific cultural regulations, and optimizing their local environments to deliberately make the state inhospitable to blue cultural and economic competitors.
They are driving the blue faction out to structurally cement their own unassailable one-party rule. The ant colonies are purging their hives.
But the most terrifying, visceral example the source provides of this state as a startup logic has to do with how these organisms actually manage their internal domestic crises. It explains why nothing ever seems to get fixed. Look deeply at the homelessness crisis in San Francisco.
This is the NGO incentive structure. When I first read this part of the transcript, it felt incredibly dark, but mathematically, it makes perfect chilling sense. Let's walk through the actual incentives.
San Francisco, as a city, awards well over $1 billion a year to a sprawling network of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who are theoretically tasked with managing and solving the homelessness crisis. Now, apply the ruthless logic of a startup to the bureaucracy of an NGO.
Okay.
If you are the CEO of a tech startup, what is your fiduciary duty? Your goal is to grow your user base, capture more market share, expand your operations, and thereby justify demanding a vastly larger budget from your venture capital investors for the next fiscal quarter.
Growth is the only metric of survival. So if you are the executive director of a massive homelessness NGO, your entire billion-dollar budget, your six-figure salary, your institutional prestige, your political leverage, and the employment of your thousands of staff members are entirely 100% dependent on the continued existence of homeless people on the streets.
Which creates a terrifying, unspoken biological incentive. To survive and grow, your startup needs more homeless people, not fewer. Think about the outcome if you actually succeeded.
If an NGO devised a brilliant strategy and effectively solved the homelessness crisis in San Francisco, what would happen?
The crisis disappears, the political urgency vanishes, the billion-dollar funding pipeline completely dries up, the organization goes bankrupt, and the executives lose all their power.
The organism would be committing suicide by solving the problem. Therefore, the emergent intelligence of the NGO meta-organism optimizes to sustain and grow the problem in order to justify growing the funding.
They distribute resources, tents, needles, localized services in a way that manages the symptoms but systemically perpetuates the crisis. It becomes a self-licking ice cream cone of bureaucratic survival. The suffering of the population is the raw material the startup mines for capital.
And again, the source is incredibly careful to balance the scale here. This dynamic of manufacturing a crisis to sustain a bureaucracy is not solely a blue phenomenon. The framework explicitly points out that the red, Republican equivalent of this exact same biological dynamic is the military-industrial complex.
Let's apply the exact same logic. If you are a massive defense contractor or a Pentagon bureaucrat whose entire institutional survival, political power, and trillion-dollar budget depends on the manufacturing of weapons and the deployment of force, what is your incentive?
Your incentive is a world that is perpetually teetering on the razor's edge of catastrophic conflict. If world peace broke out tomorrow, the military startup would go bankrupt.
Therefore, the meta-organism subtly optimizes foreign policy, intelligence assessments, and diplomatic posturing to ensure a constant state of low-level global friction. It is the exact same underlying mechanism of organizational survival, just applied to different pools of resources and different types of fear.
The organism must acquire more resources to grow, regardless of the cost to the host. So let's synthesize what we've built in our force diagram so far. We have an invisible macroeconomic system constantly shrinking the wealth and purchasing power of the average person.
We have massive technological and global forces, AI and China, crushing the traditional employment bases of both major political parties.
And in response to this existential threat, these political parties have retreated to their geographic strongholds. They have transformed state governments into localized, heavily fortified, one-party startups that are violently optimizing for their own bureaucratic survival at the expense of everything else.
Which inevitably forces us to ask the ultimate structural question of this entire deep dive. If the individual states are functioning as isolated, radically polarized startups actively warring against each other for resources, what happens to the overarching concept of the United States?
Welcome to the splintering of America. In the source material, there is a statement that is just jarring to read because it pierces through the illusion we all maintain. The author simply states, America doesn't exist anymore.
Not in the unified functional sense we were taught in civics class. The argument is that there is no singular America. There is only Blue America, Red America, and Tech America, all occupying the same landmass, but operating under entirely different rules.
We are currently witnessing what the framework calls soft secession.
And this is where the integration of historical perspective becomes absolutely vital. When a lot of people hear talk of secession or extreme political polarization, they comfort themselves with a mental model of homeostasis.
Right, the idea of the political pendulum. I want to jump in and play devil's advocate for a second because this is the standard argument you hear from moderates. They say, look, we've been deeply divided before. The country has been through worse. Think about the late 1960s political assassinations, race riots burning down cities, the intense division over the Vietnam War.
Or look at the brutal partisan warfare of the late 1800s.
Yeah. The pendulum swings to the radical left, it swings to the radical right, but gravity always eventually dampens the momentum and brings it back to the sensible center. We always return to equilibrium.
It is a comforting thought, but to counter that exact argument, the source introduces a deeply unsettling counter-analogy from the world of structural engineering. The Tacoma-Narrows Bridge, historically known as Galloping Gertie.
For those who aren't familiar with the engineering history, the Tacoma Narrows was a massive, state-of-the-art suspension bridge built in the 1940s in Washington state. It was considered a marvel of modern infrastructure.
But the engineers didn't fully account for the aerodynamic forces of the local environment. When the wind hit the bridge at a specific speed and angle, the deck started to sway. Now, a pendulum, by the laws of physics, naturally swings back to a state of rest. But this bridge encountered a phenomenon known as aeroelastic flutter.
The wind pushed the bridge to the left, but instead of dampening the energy, the structure of the bridge caught the wind in a way that threw it even harder to the right.
The oscillations didn't dampen, they amplified. It became a positive feedback loop of kinetic energy. The bridge swung left, then violently right, twisting the concrete.
And the meta-organisms we've discussed, cornered by tech, cornered by China, suffocating under Keynesian debt, are no longer acting rationally to find a moderate center. They are caught in aeroelastic flutter. Blue attacks red, which justifies red attacking blue even harder. They're acting desperately, swinging wider and wider to the extremes.
And what happened to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge? It didn't find the center. It twisted until the concrete shattered, the massive steel suspension cables snapped like guitar strings, and the entire multi-million-dollar structure tore itself apart and collapsed into the Puget Sound.
The analytical framework argues that the American political system is no longer a pendulum. It is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, moments before the cables snap. And we can mathematically measure this extreme oscillation. We aren't just talking about people disagreeing on tax policy over Thanksgiving dinner.
Now, the source points out that this ideological divide is literally morphing into a biological divide. He cites a statistic that represents a profound structural fracture. Currently, only 4% of Democrats marry Republicans.
Let's unpack the implications of that 4%. We are biologically segregating ourselves based on political ideology.
When an ideological group completely stops intermarrying with their political rivals, they cease to be just a political party. Over the course of a generation, that ideology calcifies into biology. They stop sharing family trees, they stop sharing cultural touchstones, they stop sharing a fundamental premise of reality.
They become distinct ethnocultural tribes. We're seeing levels of cultural separation in the United States that mirror historically catastrophic religious divides,
Mhm.
akin to the split between Protestants and Catholics in Europe or Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East.
It begins as a digital secession, which we have already completely normalized. The blues retreat to highly moderated networks like Threads or Bluesky, where their worldview is algorithmically reinforced. The reds retreat to networks like X or Truth Social.
They technically speak the same English language, but the foundational facts they use to construct their reality have zero overlap. But the framework argues this soft secession is bleeding out of the digital realm and into physical geopolitical reality.
We can observe soft secession in action right now on the global stage. The governors of these entrenched, one-party startup states are no longer acting like local administrators of a federal system. They are beginning to act like sovereign heads of independent nations, actively conducting their own rogue foreign policy to secure their meta-organism's survival, often in direct opposition to Washington, D.C.
The source gives two massive, undeniable examples of this dynamic. First, let's look at California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Recently, Newsom completely bypassed the federal diplomatic apparatus and traveled directly to China. He was received with state-level honors, meeting with top officials to establish California as a long-term stable partner with Beijing.
During this trip, he explicitly signaled a willingness to ignore federal trade hostilities, suggesting California ports could bypass or mitigate federal tariffs to maintain the flow of cheap Chinese imports.
That is a subnational state openly undermining the federal empire's foreign policy to secure its own local economic survival.
It is the absolute logic of the meta-organism at work. If the Republican-leaning or even moderate blue federal government is attacking China with tariffs, the pure blue California organism recognizes it lacks physical manufacturing. Therefore, it strategically allies with China to secure the physical resources it desperately needs.
The enemy of my enemy is my vital trading partner. The federal union is treated as an obstacle, not a homeland.
And the framework points to an even more extreme example of these soft secession dynamics playing out internationally with Mark Carney, a highly influential figure in Canadian politics and global finance.
Carney has essentially proposed positioning Canada as a geopolitical land bridge for Chinese infrastructure into North America. He suggested allowing China to build and manage portions of the Canadian electrical grid, circumventing U.S. security regulations and concerns.
He even floated the surreal possibility of relying on Chinese drone defenses to protect Greenland.
It's wild to try and map this out. You have the blue meta-organism trying to align with the Chinese meta-organism for physical resources and climate tech. You have the red meta-organism trying to build physical and tariff walls to isolate the country. You have the tech meta-organism trying to decentralize globally, building AI in the cloud to escape both of them.
It was a multi-front war tearing the fabric of the continent apart.
But the source issues a grave, historically grounded warning about the reality of this disunion. He references a historical analysis, a book simply titled Disunion, which deeply analyzes the political and psychological lead-up to the American Civil War in the 1850s and 60s.
The modern retrospective understanding of the Civil War is usually framed almost entirely around the moral evil of slavery, which is, of course, absolutely central to the conflict. But the source points out that for the people actually living at the time, the politicians, the merchants, the average citizens, there was another overriding existential terror driving the desperation of the conflict: the fear of European anarchy.
Exactly. The original founders of the nation and the leaders trying to hold it together in the 1860s looked across the Atlantic Ocean at Europe. What did they see? A fragmented, chaotic continent made up of dozens of small, squabbling states.
These European states were constantly engaging in brutal, localized wars over resources, constantly levying punitive tariffs against each other, and stifling economic progress through endless border friction.
The concept of the Union wasn't just a sentimental, patriotic ideal. It was a ruthless economic and security imperative.
The United States was brilliantly designed to be the largest, uninterrupted free trade zone in human history. The economies of scale provided by a united, friction-free continent, where a good manufactured in New York could be sold in California without a tariff, using a single currency under a single military umbrella, are what created the unprecedented anomaly of American global prosperity.
If the Tacoma-Narrows Bridge actually collapses, if the United States genuinely fragments into a hard or even a permanent soft secession of red, blue, and tech states, the loss of those continental economies of scale will be devastating to the standard of living.
Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of needing a passport to drive from California to Texas. Imagine paying a 15% export tariff to ship agricultural goods from the Midwest to the East Coast.
It would plunge the North American continent into the exact same economic friction and localized chaos that the Union was explicitly built to prevent. The pie wouldn't just shrink, it would shatter.
So let's take a deep breath and step back to look at the completed force diagram we've built over the last hour. It is a portrait of extreme compounding volatility. The bridge is oscillating violently in the wind.
The blue faction is utilizing wealth taxes and the regulatory state to attack tech, and weaponizing the justice system to attack red.
The red faction is utilizing immigration restrictions to attack tech's global talent pool and actively dismantling the global diplomatic empire that blue relies on.
Tech is fighting back by using AI to automate blue's cognitive jobs out of existence and decentralizing overseas to avoid red's physical tariffs.
Every single major foundational system, macroeconomics, domestic politics, global diplomacy, and technology, is simultaneously breaking under the immense pressure of these competing singularities and evolutionary survival instincts.
Which brings us to the most urgent, practical question for you, the listener.
If you are standing in the middle of this force diagram, watching the AI singularities rocket upward, watching the Keynesian debt gravity pull the economy downward, watching the political meta-organisms tear the bridge apart, what is your strategic move?
How do the smartest, most historically aware people respond to a multi-system breakdown of this magnitude?
The framework provides advice here that is blunt, highly pragmatic, and completely upends traditional financial wisdom. The core thesis is that in an era of massive, systemic, geographic instability, location is vastly more important than allocation.
That is a direct strike against the standard Wall Street advice. It doesn't matter how perfectly diversified your stock portfolio is or how well you've balanced your bonds and equities. If you are physically living in a state that suddenly decides to seize those assets through extreme taxation.
Or if you live in a city whose bureaucratic startup has allowed basic physical security and infrastructure to collapse.
Exactly. You cannot outinvest a collapsing host organism. His core strategic framework is what he calls finding the eye of the hurricane. You are an individual. You cannot stop the macro storm. You cannot stop the Fed from printing money. And you cannot stop AI from advancing.
But you can strategically navigate to the geographic pockets of low pressure where the destructive forces of the storm essentially cancel each other out. And because the internet has drastically reduced the cost, friction, and necessity of physical presence for many jobs, you have the unprecedented ability to vote with your feet.
The mantra he provides is liquidate, immigrate, and accelerate. You have to liquidate your rigid, localized assets that trap you in a descending geography. You have to immigrate to a safer, more stable physical jurisdiction. And you have to accelerate your technological independence by adopting AI and decentralized tools before they replace you.
The source actually maps out what he considers the ascending versus descending geographies on the global board. If you are determined to stay within the borders of the United States, he points to regions like Texas and the greater Miami area in Florida.
Culturally and economically, these Sunbelt regions are structurally grouping closer to the ascending, unapologetically capitalist-leaning leaders emerging in Latin America, figures like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador or Javier Milei in Argentina.
He specifically highlights El Salvador, calling it a literal startup state. It's a nation that was entirely broken by violence, but is now operating with a completely different, forward-looking metalogic, embracing technological decentralization and ruthless physical security to attract global capital.
On a broader global scale, he points heavily toward Eastern Europe, specifically nations like Poland and Hungary. The logic here is deeply historical, because these specific nations suffered through the absolute brutal reality of the 20th century under actual Soviet communism. Because they remember the guys with guns kicking down the doors, they have developed what he terms civilizational antibodies.
They are highly culturally resistant to the creeping bureaucratic overreach, the central planning, and the ideological policing that is currently dragging down Western Europe and the Blue American faction. They value hard borders and physical reality.
He also highlights India and Southeast Asia as massive, ascending technological and demographic nodes. The overarching message is starkly clear. The map of global prosperity, which has been static since the end of World War II, is currently being radically redrawn.
You need to look at the force diagram and ensure you are standing on the right side of the borderline before the ink dries.
It represents a profound generational shift in how we are forced to calculate risk. For the last 70 years, the absolute safest bet a human being could make was to buy a house in a major Western cultural center, invest a portion of their income in an S&P 500 index fund, trust the stability of the local meta-organism to maintain order, and retire.
The framework we've explored today argues that this default unthinking strategy is now the highest risk play on the board. Trusting a fracturing system is riskier than navigating the chaos.
Okay, let's pull all of this together and wrap up the massive journey we've been on. We started by looking at a medical X-ray, searching for a clean, simple diagnosis to explain the anxiety of the modern world.
Instead, we found a force diagram populated by a plurality of technological singularities. AI agents writing code, solar panels powering off-grid villages, robotics rewiring logistics, all rocketing upward at an exponential pace.
We identified the invisible evolutionary camouflage of Keynesian debt, printing the mosquito, quietly extracting wealth, and silently shrinking the economic pie, forcing citizens to fight each other over the scraps.
We watched that shrinking pie and technological disruption trigger a brutal four-faction war, where the internet cannibalized the Democrats' information monopoly and China hollowed out the Republicans' industrial base.
We examined the terrifying biological logic of the political meta-organism, transforming state governments into localized startups that optimize solely for their own bureaucratic power and funding rather than the prosperity or safety of their host citizens.
And we saw the Tacoma Narrows Bridge of the American system oscillating violently toward a soft secession, driven by biological polarization, forcing anyone paying attention to seek the eye of the hurricane.
It is a dark, incredibly complex, but ultimately clarifying framework. It takes the senseless chaos of the daily news cycle and assigns it a ruthless structural logic.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. Throughout the source material, there's a recurring phrase regarding the future of human organization. He says the future is cloud first, land last, but not land never.
Think deeply about the implications of that sequence. Historically, your physical location dictated absolutely everything about your life. Your community, your economic opportunity, your moral framework, and your physical security.
If you wanted to build a tech company, Silicon Valley had to exist in a physical valley in California. You had to go to the land.
But the source pointed out a startling data point. Today, there are over 420 different cities globally hosting billion-dollar tech unicorns. The physical necessity of the valley is entirely gone. The economy has uploaded to the cloud.
Now combine that technological reality with the political reality we just mapped out. The fracturing of physical nations into highly partisan, combative, structurally dysfunctional startup states.
Here is the thought experiment to mull over as you navigate the rest of your week. What if the very concept of citizenship in the 21st century stops being an accident of geography?
Historically, you were simply born on a specific patch of dirt, and you owed allegiance to whoever controlled that dirt. But what if citizenship transitions into a digital subscription service that you intentionally, ideologically opt into?
If a cloud-based network state, a decentralized community of aligned individuals, can offer better protection for your wealth against inflation using cryptocurrency and better upskilling networks to protect your cognitive labor against AI than your crumbling physical municipality can.
Will your digital passport, the cryptographically secure network state you belong to in the cloud, soon mean vastly more to your physical survival, your prosperity, and your identity than the little blue booklet sitting in your desk drawer?
It's a question that challenges the foundation of the Westphalian nation-state. It redefines the very nature of how humans will organize to survive the plural singularities.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense, expansive deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible forces acting on your life. Keep looking past the outrage of the daily headlines to see the structure underneath, and keep watching the diagram. We'll catch you on the next one.